Hey, how's it going, everybody? Alex here, and today I'm going to show you how you can implement kind authentication into your Medusa V2 instance running, first of all, Next.js for your storefront. We're going to be using Prisma as our ORM and Postgres as our database of choice. So the reason for this is because I don't really want to have to use the internal functions of Medusa to run or to manage my authentication. I'd rather delegate that to some third party that actually knows how to manage the security of my customers. So that's exactly what we're going to be doing, and let's get started. So the first thing you're going to do is you're going to register on Kind, and you're going to want to create your own business. So I'm going to go ahead and show you that process. What I can do is I can just go to an existing one that I already have and click on switch business and add a business. Perfect. So in the business name, we're going to call this Medusa Kind, and it's going to generate a domain for me, 1 to 10 employees, and I'm going to select the region closest to me and hit save. So it can only contain letters or numbers, so Medusa Kind. There you go. That should work out. Once I hit save, it's going to create the business, so let's give it a quick moment. And there you go. Now the next thing that we have to do is click onto the business that we just created. So I'm going to click on the subdomain. After we do that, we're going to be prompted to select start a project from scratch or use Kind with my existing code base. I'm just going to click on use Kind with my existing code base, hit on next. Afterwards, I'm going to make sure that I select Next.js, which is right here, as the SDK that we're going to utilize for this project. Hit next. Afterwards, we're going to select the authentication methods. In this case, I'm just going to select email and username and code. These are going to be the two options that I select, but you can add as many as you'd like. Afterwards, hit next. And then just like that, you can now select on connect your Next.js code base. You can click connect, and we can get started with VS Code. So let's go ahead and pop that open. And now what we need to do, if you don't already have a storefront running Next.js, is we have to launch it ourselves. So in the root directory, we're going to type in npx create next app at latest. What is your project going to be named? I'm just going to call this Storefront. Would you like to use TypeScript? Yes. ESLint? Yes. Tailwind? Yes. Source directory? No. App router? Yes. And would you like to customize the default import alias? We're going to hit no. And let's give it a moment while it sets up. All right, now that it's finished installing, what we have to do is go into our storefront and install the SDK. So we're going to click on Storefront, open an integrated terminal. I'm going to copy this npm command, paste, hit enter, and let it install. Awesome, it's been successfully installed, and we can verify it by just going to our package.json and making sure that we have this dependency right here, which we do. So we can go ahead and close it. And then the next step is to update the environmental variable. So it says to create an environmental, a local environmental file in your root directory. So I'm going to add new file, say .env.local. And then I'm going to copy paste these environmental variables and put them here. I'm going to blur it because obviously it contains sensitive information, but all you would have to do is just copy what's here, paste, and as you can see here, it says hidden until copied. Well, once you actually do paste it, obviously, into your Visual Studio, the Kind client secret ID is going to show. So now that that's done, we can go ahead and hit save and close out of it. Now, the next thing that we need to do is we need to create the API endpoints. That way it can successfully register, log in, and log out our users. So where it says API endpoints, it says to create a folder within your app directory called API. Within the API, we're going to create another folder called auth. Within auth, we create another folder called kind auth. So let's type it in exactly like this. And then within it, we're going to create a file called route.ts. Once we do so, we can just copy these bits of code, paste it into our route.ts, save it, and we are finished with the API endpoint section of Kind. Cool, so now the next thing that we need to do is we need to make sure that we can see login and register and log out buttons in our storefront. That way we could just, speed through all of these things. So what we're going to do is we're going to go to our page.tsx in our root folder, or actually within the app folder, sorry. We're going to delete everything that's within main. So let's delete it. I'm also going to just remove these class names from Tailwind. And now here, what I can do is just copy the import to get the register link and the login link. I'm also going to add the log out link. And now what we can do is just grab these two components, put them within our main tag, and let's also go ahead and add the log out link. Log out, and hit save, or I think this is one word, right? Yeah, there you go. And just like that, we should be able to see these buttons on the front end. So I'm going to go ahead and run npm run dev. It's going to launch the development server. So it's already ready. We can just go to localhost 3000. And the only thing that we should see in our homepage is these three components: sign in, sign up, and we're not seeing sign out or log out. I don't know why. It's probably because we're not authenticated right now, which is probably why we can't see it, but I guess we'll check that out in a little bit. We can now click on sign up, and if we did the proper implementation of the route.ts, that should automatically redirect us to the subdomain of our Kinde app. So we can click on sign up, and it is redirecting us, and we have successfully implemented Kinde authentication into our app. So there's one more thing I want to do. I just want to go into my globals.css and remove the default styling that's applied, which means now if I go back to my page, everything is in white. And this video obviously isn't about styling. I just prefer it like that. So the next thing that we need to do is we need to go to the Kinde and Prisma implementation docs that they wrote. It's actually just a blog. You can see it over here called Set Up a Next.js App with Prisma, ORM, and Kinde Auth. And once we're here, we can actually just skip over everything that it's saying here. The important thing to check is on step 5 that the callbacks in our Kinde app contain auth Kinde callback as well as localhost 3000/dashboard. This one, I guess it's optional because we're not actually going to be creating this endpoint, but we can verify that all of this is properly implemented by going to the application, going to, I believe it's, I'll tell you right now, I believe it's details. Scrolling down, and here where it says allowed callback URLs, we see 3000/API auth Kinde callback. And like I mentioned, we're not going to be adding the dashboard route because it's just not a route that we're going to be implementing. Cool, so we can go ahead and skip all of this in the documentation because these are all things that we've already done. And now what we need to do is we need to install Prisma, right? So we're going to go ahead and run these commands. This is a little bit weird to copy, so let's go to our terminal, paste it, hit enter, and allow it to install the Prisma development dependency, install the Prisma client, and initialize a Prisma instance in our storefront. So now that we've done that, we're going to get a success message over here in our terminal. And what we have to do is we need to go to our environmental variables folder, go to where it says database URL, and we're going to be replacing the default one with the database that is going to be managing your storefront, right? So the way that I do it, I just always like to go to Railway, deploy database. As you can see, if I go here and I go to the data, it's an empty database. There's nothing in here. So what I'm going to do is go to my variables, copy my public URL, go to my env file, and replace what's in it. Let's remove this with the real database URL, save it, and we're done. Now, the next part of the documentation is going to our Prisma folder, which you'll see this folder only if you ran npx Prisma init. If you didn't run it, you're not going to see it. So go ahead and run it if you haven't. And there's going to be a folder called schema, or sorry, a file called schema.prisma. If we click it, we'll see this default boilerplate. Now, the next thing that we need to do is just simply make sure that, first of all, the provider that you selected is the one that actually matches your database. So in this case, I am going to be using PostgreSQL. This is going to be referencing the environmental variable where we just replaced the default one with our actual database. And now we need to create a model. And this model is going to be a user model because, as I mentioned, we are going to be essentially removing the user managing aspect of Medusa and implementing Kinde. So what we can do is we can just copy this default model onto our schema and save it. One more thing we need to do is, I guess I didn't copy completely, just add string. And let's close out of it. Cool. And so basically what's happening here is we're adding an ID as an integer, and it's going to auto increment every time a new row is created. We're going to add the Kinde ID to the user model. We're going to be adding an email. These two things are unique. No other user should contain a duplicate value. Same for first name, same for last name. And one more thing that we want to add that isn't here in the documentation, obviously, is type Medusa customer ID as a string. And it's also going to be unique. This variable should not, or I guess this entry should not be replicated, should not be duplicated. Now, what we can do is go back to our terminal, and we're going to type in npx prisma db push. Allow it 1 moment while it pushes these changes to the database. And once it does, you can type in npx Prisma generate, which is going to create the types for our schema. And you should already receive a confirmation message in your terminal if everything went well. Cool, so everything's gone well. Now the next thing that we need to set up is a route that people are going to land on the moment that they successfully register or log in through Kind, right? And the way that we're going to do that is under the API folder. As you can see here in the documentation as well, we need to put it under API, auth, and create a folder within auth called success. And within success, we're going to create a file called route.ts. And what we can do is go ahead and just copy the code that they've provided us. We're not going to be using all of it, but it's a really good place to start if you don't want to copy everything here, right? Now, here's the thing. Next.js, if you're using Next.js and Prisma together, due to the hot reloading, sometimes multiple Prisma instances get initialized and you'll receive a message in your terminal that says like 10 different Prisma instances running, and you want to avoid that happening. So what I would recommend doing is going to your Storefront file, create another folder called utils, and within it, we're going to create db.ts. And in here, we're going to just create a simple execution that initializes the Prisma client and closes out of it immediately after executing a command. So the way we can do this is just go to Google real quick, type in Prisma client util, and there should be a page called Best Practice for Instantiating Prisma Client. Click it, and to where it says solution, make sure that you copy this and just paste it here. Essentially what it's doing, like I mentioned, is it creates a new Prisma client, and once it's done, it'll just kill itself. So now that we have that, what we can do is, instead of importing the Prisma client, we can just import Prisma from our utils folder. We no longer need to instantiate it here, and save it. And like I mentioned, you're not really gonna have to do a whole lot of changes here. The only thing that we have to do is, first of all, where it says if a database user is not found. Well, actually, let me explain to you what this does. This first gets the user information after they log in, and after it has it, if it detected that somebody tried to use this endpoint without actually being logged in, it's gonna throw an error. Otherwise, it's gonna try to find a database user with the kind ID. Remember that in our model, I'm gonna load it up here. Remember, in our model, we have an ID and a kind ID. So it's going to try to find a user where the kind ID is equal to the user ID. User is not referring to user ID here. It's referring to the logged in user's information. So if you were to, for example, console log user, remember, this is coming from Kind themselves. There's a property called ID. So essentially what you're saying is where the kind ID in your database matches the ID of Kind after they've authenticated. So just make sure that you understand that difference. If there's no database user, it's going to create that in our users table. And there's one more thing that we need to add here. I'm going to just delete this. We're going to also have to add the Medusa customer ID. Now, we don't have this just yet, right? Because we haven't set up the logic for it in our backend, but we are going to be doing it in a moment. So I'm just going to comment this out for now while we finish the setting up. Now, speaking of setting up, what we have to do is we have to go into our backend and generate a token that's going to allow us to hit our backend and create a customer whenever somebody creates an account through Kind. So make sure that you have your backend, and let's run it. All right, so once it's running, we can just go to localhost 9000/app. We're going to go to our store settings, go to secret API keys. And as you can see, I already have a secret API key here. In your case, all you're going to do is go to create, put a title, and it's going to give it to you. You can only see it once, so make sure you copy it. And I can't create another one. Medusa doesn't let you do that. So just make sure that you have your token. And after you do that, you can go back to your storefront, go to your .env.local, and you're going to paste it here. In this case, I'm just going to type in Medusa API key. And I'm going to copy and paste that right here. All right, so once that's finished, what we want to do is we want to create a customer on MedusaJS app whenever a user is created here on Kind. And the way that we do that is on the check if the database user exists, we're going to do a nested fetch request. Yes, it's a nested fetch request. Sue me. I know it's not best practice, but you can go ahead and implement it with webhooks or however you want, right? So in this case, we're going to say const response is equal to await fetch and the URL of wherever your MedusaJS instance lives. In my case, it's local, so localhost 9000 / admin / customers. This is the default route for creating a customer on MedusaJS. And it's going to be of post. We need to add some headers in here, which is going to be authorization. And the authorization, just write basic. And in here is going to be your process.env.medusa API key, which is what you just created. And additionally, we need to add the content type, and say application/JSON. Cool. I forgot to add a comma here, so let's add it. And we can save it. Now what we need to do is we need to send a body. So to type in body, JSON, stringify. And I'm going to go ahead and just copy what I have in my already existing implementation. Just so you know what happens in, it's going to create a customer with the email being equal to the kind email that they use to register. The company name, in this case, this is totally optional. This doesn't even have to go. Your first name, also whatever you use to register, whatever the user uses to register, and their last name as well, their phone number if they gave one. Now, there's one more thing that you need to do. If you go to your Medusa V2 docs and you go, let's close the sidebar and go to our, I believe we're using the admin API, go to customers and go to create a customer. Give it 1 second while it loads. Create customer, here you go. So you can pass metadata. It should be somewhere here. Let me find where, here it is. You can pass metadata that is going to be the same for essentially every customer. So obviously I want every single customer to have a kind ID. So essentially the way that we tie Medusa with kind is by in the metadata putting their kind ID. So we can just expand this and say metadata, say kind ID is equal to user.id. And just like that, we have successfully synced the kind ID with your Medusa backend. So now whenever a post request is sent to this endpoint, which is going to be every time a user registers, because remember, this is checks if there isn't an existing database user, once it sends it, it's going to create it with their kind ID tied to it. And once that's done, what we can do is await the data. So const data is going to be await response.json. And what we can do now where we're creating our user is uncomment the Medusa customer ID and say data dot, I believe it's customer dot ID. And now what this is going to do is it's going to, first of all, create the customer in the Medusa endpoint. Afterwards, it's going to bring us a response that contains the customer's ID. And then we're going to create that user, a row of that user in our database where the Medusa customer ID is equal to the response that we got from this endpoint. And the last step here is to just simply remove dashboard, because remember, we're not using that route. And after it successfully does all of these steps, it's just going to redirect the user back to localhost 3000. All right, so once this is set up, the last thing that we need to do is we need to make sure that when a user actually signs up, the redirection link is actually this endpoint, because it's once they hit this endpoint and all of this process is executed that they're going to be redirected to localhost 3000. So how do we do that? Well, if you remember, you created a couple of environmental variables here, and where it says kind post login redirect URL, instead of localhost 3000/dashboard, which is the default one, we're going to say /API/auth/success. And you can verify that that is the path by just looking over here in your directory. We're going to be hitting success. And from here is where I mentioned that eventually after it executes everything, it's going to redirect us to localhost/3000. So what we can do is just save everything. I'm going to make sure that my environmental variables are saved as well. Cool, they are. So now what we can do is open up a incognito browser, go to sign up. Where it says first name, we're just going to add ours and our last name and our email. Let's type it in one more time and hit continue. Now I'm going to receive a login code to my inbox, so give me one quick second. All right, so we have it right here. I'm going to copy this code, paste it here, and we're going to look at our terminal to make sure that everything executed properly. And if we are redirected to 3000, that means everything did work. So we hit continue. and it successfully compiled. It hit the URL. It's executing all these commands, and it redirected us back to localhost 3000. So now let's look at the database to make sure that our user actually got registered there. So if we go to Kind and we open up the business that we created and go to users, what you'll see here is my name, last name, my email, the username that I used to sign up, and the date that it was added. So in terms of Kind, the user is created there, and now we need to make sure that our Prisma database contains the Medusa customer ID. So we can go to Railway, go to Kind tutorial database, which is the one that I'm using. You go to yours, click on data, go to user, and what do we have here? We have the Kind ID. We have the email of the person, the first name, the last name, and the Medusa customer ID. So now we have successfully tied in the user with Medusa. This is me from the future. I forgot to show you how this actually looks in your Medusa instance. So if you go to your backend and you go to your customer section, as you can see, the account that was created is right here. I can click onto it. And if I go to the metadata, we see that we have one key. We can open it, and what do we see? The Kind ID. So the connection was created. So I hope this tutorial helped you out. This is a very bare bones implementation, right? There's a whole bunch of stuff that you have to do, like permissions and other types of authorization. So go ahead and implement those, but at least you have a fairly good concept of how all this works together.